The Great Hall of the Galactic Council buzzed with worried voices as delegates from across the galaxy gathered for what many believed would be their final emergency session. The massive chamber on Nexus Prime had witnessed countless historic moments over the past 2 centuries, but never had the atmosphere been so heavy with despair and fear. Ambassador Lisa Monroe sat quietly in the human observation section, her blue eyes scanning the assembled representatives of 47 different species. The humans had held observer status for 50 years now, content to watch and learn while building peaceful trade relationships with their galactic neighbors. Earth's philosophy had always been simple: stay neutral, avoid conflict, and focus on mutual prosperity through commerce and cultural exchange. The war had changed everything. For 3 long years, the Vorthan Empire had swept across the Outer Rim territories like a plague of locusts, consuming everything in their path. Their massive fleets of black warships struck without warning, demanded unconditional surrender, and showed no mercy to those who resisted. 17 star systems had already fallen under their brutal rule, and their advance showed no signs of slowing. Council Speaker Zephyr rose from the central platform, her crystalline form catching the light from the chamber's artificial suns. The Andorian Collective had held the speaker position for decades, and Zephyr's normally melodious voice now carried undertones of desperation that made even the most stoic delegates shift uncomfortably in their seats. "Honored representatives," Zephyr began. Her words translated instantly into dozens of languages through the chamber's neural network. "We face the darkest hour in our recorded history. The Celestial Alliance has suffered catastrophic losses at the Battle of Kepler's Edge. Admiral, Vextar reports that only 12% of our combined fleet managed to escape the Vorthan ambush." A collective gasp echoed through the chamber. The Battle of Kepler's Edge had been the Alliance's last major stronghold, their final line of defense before the Vorthan advance could reach the core worlds. The loss meant that billions of innocent civilians now lay directly in the path of an enemy that had never shown mercy to conquered populations. The Rigelian delegate, a massive insectoid creature whose compound eyes reflected the chamber's lights like scattered diamonds, clicked his mandibles in agitation.
"Speaker Zephyr, the Rigelian Republic has already committed 70% of our military resources to this conflict.
Our shipyards work around the clock, but we cannot replace vessels faster than the Vorthans destroy them." Similar voices of frustration and despair rose from across the chamber. The Tauri Confederation had lost 3 entire worlds to Vorthan occupation. The Centauri League faced economic collapse from supporting the war effort. Even the mighty Draconian hegemony, with their reputation for military excellence, had suffered humiliating defeats against Vorthan battle tactics. Lisa Monroe listened to the litany of defeats and excuses with growing concern. She had served as Earth's representative for 8 years, and in all that time, she had never seen the galactic community so thoroughly demoralized. The species that had once seemed so advanced and sophisticated now appeared fragile and helpless in the face of genuine adversity. The Vorthan Empire's strategy was as simple as it was effective. Their scouts would identify systems with valuable resources or strategic importance. Their intelligence networks would analyze local defenses, and then their war fleets would arrive in overwhelming force. They offered each target the same choice: immediate surrender and incorporation into the Empire, or total destruction followed by occupation anyway. What made the Vorthans so terrifying was not just their military might, but their complete indifference to casualties. While galactic civilization had evolved beyond the primitive concept of total war, the Vorthans embraced it completely. They targeted military and civilian installations with equal enthusiasm, treating conquered populations as resources to be exploited rather than people to be governed. Zephyr's voice cut through the murmur of worried conversations. "The Vorthan fleet commander has transmitted new demands. They require the surrender of the Proxima system within 10 standard days, or they will begin systematic bombardment of all inhabited worlds in that sector." The Proxima system contained over 4 billion inhabitants across 6 planets. The thought of such massive loss of life sent waves of horror through the assembled delegates. Yet even faced with such a terrible ultimatum, the galaxy's response remained predictably inadequate. The Altarian representative suggested another round of diplomatic negotiations, apparently forgetting that the Vorthans had executed the last 3 peace envoys. The Vegan collective proposed economic sanctions, as if trade restrictions could somehow influence a military empire that took whatever it wanted by force. Others called for evacuation efforts that everyone knew would save only a tiny fraction of the threatened populations. Lisa Monroe found herself thinking about Earth's own history, about the countless wars that had shaped human civilization before they reached the stars. Her species had endured conflicts that made the current galactic crisis seem almost restrained by comparison. Humans understood something that these peaceful, advanced civilizations had apparently forgotten during their centuries of prosperity. Sometimes evil could only be stopped by those willing to fight it without restraint. As the debate continued, Lisa noticed the growing desperation in the delegates' voices. These beings had built a magnificent galactic civilization based on cooperation, mutual respect, and peaceful resolution of conflicts. They had created wonders that humanity could barely comprehend. Cities that floated in gas-giant atmospheres, space habitats that housed billions, technology that seemed almost magical to human observers. But they had also grown soft. Their military forces were designed for peacekeeping operations and border disputes, not for the kind of brutal warfare that the Vorthons practiced. Their political systems prioritized consensus and compromise, making rapid military response nearly impossible. Their cultural values emphasized preservation of life above all else, which made them predictable and exploitable to enemies, who shared no such restraints. The session dragged on for hours as speaker after speaker rose to voice their concerns and propose solutions that everyone knew would fail. Some delegates quietly began discussing evacuation plans for their own homeworlds, preparing to abandon the alliance rather than face certain defeat. Others spoke of retreating to the galactic core and establishing new defensive lines, effectively surrendering half the galaxy to Vorthon control. Lisa Monroe remained silent throughout these discussions, but her mind was racing. She thought about the reports she had been receiving from Earth, about the heated debates in the United Earth government, about the growing pressure from human military leaders who watched the galactic situation with increasing alarm. Earth's position had always been clear: maintain neutrality, avoid entanglement in alien conflicts, focus on building peaceful relationships with all species. But neutrality had its limits, and Lisa was beginning to wonder if those limits had already been crossed. The Vorthons had made it clear that they viewed the entire galaxy as their rightful territory. Earth's isolation would only last as long as the Vorthons had more attractive targets to pursue. Eventually, they would turn their attention to the Sol system, and when that day came, humanity would face the same choice that had been offered to 47 other civilizations. As the session moved toward its inevitable conclusion without any meaningful resolution, Lisa Monroe made a decision that would change the course of galactic history. She stood up slowly, her movement causing a ripple of surprised murmurs through the chamber. Humans rarely spoke during council sessions, preferring to observe and learn rather than participate in what they considered alien affairs. Zephyr noticed the movement and paused in her closing remarks. Does the human delegation wish to address the council? Lisa Monroe walked toward the central platform with steady, confident steps that contrasted sharply with the defeated posture of most other delegates. The chamber fell silent as 47 different species focused their attention on the representative of what many considered the galaxy's most insignificant member, civilization. She reached the speaking platform and looked out over the assembled delegates, knowing that her next words would either be dismissed as the futile gesture of a desperate species or remembered as the moment when everything changed. Lisa Monroe stood at the central platform and looked out at the sea of alien faces that represented the greatest civilizations in the galaxy. The silence in the chamber was absolute, broken only by the soft hum of the translation systems and the gentle whisper of atmospheric recyclers. Every delegate leaned forward slightly, curious about what the human representative might have to say in this moment of galactic crisis. She began speaking in a calm, clear voice that carried easily through the vast chamber. Honored delegates, I have listened to your discussions today with great interest and growing concern. The situation facing our galaxy is indeed grave, and the suffering of innocent beings at the hands of the Vorthon Empire demands action from all civilized species. The delegates nodded politely, expecting the usual human offer of humanitarian Aid or perhaps increased medical supplies for refugee populations. Earth had always been generous with disaster relief and had earned respect for their compassionate response to various galactic emergencies over the decades. Lisa continued, her tone remaining steady and professional. I have been in constant communication with my government throughout this crisis, and Earth's leadership has been deeply troubled by the reports of Vorthon atrocities. The systematic destruction of civilian populations, the enslavement of conquered worlds, and the complete disregard for basic principles of civilized conduct represent everything that our species stands against. Several delegates exchanged glances, wondering where this speech was leading. The human's words were stronger than usual, but still within the bounds of typical diplomatic protest. The Rigelian delegate's compound eyes glittered with what might have been impatience, while the Centauri representative fidgeted with the datapad containing evacuation schedules for his home system. The United Earth government has spent considerable time debating our response to this crisis, Lisa said, pausing to look around the chamber. We have always maintained a policy of neutrality in galactic conflicts, believing that peaceful coexistence and mutual prosperity serve the best interests of all species. For 50 years, this philosophy has guided our interactions with the galactic community. The Altarian delegate nodded approvingly, remembering the profitable trade agreements that Earth had negotiated with his species. Humans were known for their fair dealing and their reluctance to become involved in political disputes between other civilizations. Their neutrality had made them valuable mediators in several minor conflicts over the years. Lisa's voice grew stronger, carrying a note of determination that cut through the chamber's atmosphere of defeat and despair. However, there comes a time when neutrality becomes complicity, when standing aside allows evil to triumph through the inaction of the good. The Vorthon Empire represents a threat not just to individual star systems, but to the very concept of civilization itself. Now the delegates were paying closer attention. This was not the usual diplomatic language they expected from the human representative. There was something different in her tone, something that reminded several of the older delegates of speeches they had heard during the last major galactic crisis over a century ago. After careful consideration and extensive debate, the United Earth government has reached a unanimous decision, Lisa announced, her words falling into the chamber like stones into still water. We are formally declaring our intention to join this conflict on the side of the Celestial Alliance. The reaction was immediate and explosive. Delegates leaped to their feet, their various forms of communication creating a cacophony that overwhelmed the translation systems. The draconian representative scales shifted from their usual blue to a bright orange, indicating extreme surprise. The Vegan Collective's hive mind speaker emitted a series of rapid clicks that suggested intense internal discussion among their constituent members. Zephyr raised her crystalline arms for silence, but it took several minutes for the chaos to subside enough for coherent discussion to resume. When the noise finally died down, every eye in the chamber was fixed on Lisa Monroe, who had remained calm and composed throughout the outburst. The first voice to break the stunned silence belonged to Ambassador Krex of the Vorthon Empire. The massive reptilian had been observing the council proceedings as was his right under galactic law, his presence serving as a constant reminder of the threat facing the assembled civilizations. He rose to his full height of nearly 3 meters, his scarred hide telling the story of countless battles fought and won. The human speaks of joining this conflict, Krex said, his voice carrying the cold authority of a species that had never known defeat. Does this insignificant species truly believe they understand what such words mean? The Vorthon Empire has crushed civilizations that possessed technology far beyond anything Earth has achieved. What can humans possibly contribute to a war they cannot comprehend? Lisa turned to face the Vorthon ambassador directly, showing none of the fear or deference that most species displayed when confronting their military representatives. Ambassador Krex, you are correct that Earth's technology may seem primitive compared to other galactic civilizations. Our ships are slower, our weapons less sophisticated, our military smaller than those of the great powers represented in this chamber. Krex's lipless mouth curved in what might have been a smile. Then why do you offer what can only be seen as a meaningless gesture? Your species numbers barely 8 billion beings on a single world. The Vorthan Empire controls systems with populations exceeding 100 billion. Your entire military could not crew a single one of our major battleships. Several delegates shifted uncomfortably at Krex's harsh assessment, but none could argue with his basic facts. Earth's population was indeed tiny by galactic standards, and their military technology was generations behind what most species considered modern. Even their merchant fleet, while respectable, was dwarfed by the commercial vessels of major trading civilizations. Lisa's response carried quiet confidence that seemed out of place given the obvious disparity in capabilities. You speak of numbers and technology as if they were the only factors that determine the outcome of conflicts. But history, both galactic and human, suggests that other considerations can be equally important, such as, Krex demanded, his tone suggesting that he was entertaining this conversation more out of curiosity than concern. Determination, Lisa replied simply. The willingness to sacrifice everything in defense of one's principles, the refusal to accept defeat regardless of the odds, and perhaps most importantly, the understanding that some things are worth dying for. The chamber fell silent again as delegates absorbed these words. Many species had grown comfortable during the long peace, building civilizations based on rational compromise and mutual benefit. The concept of absolute commitment to a cause, regardless of personal cost, had become foreign to cultures that had solved most problems through negotiation and technological advancement. Krex's eyes narrowed as he studied the human ambassador. You speak of dying as if it were a virtue rather than a failure. The Vorthan Empire has faced many species that claimed they would fight to the death. All of them eventually chose survival over pride when faced with the reality of our power. Lisa nodded thoughtfully. I am sure they did, Ambassador Krex, but I wonder if your empire has ever faced a species that chose death over dishonor, not out of pride, but out of love. Love for their families, their homes, their way of life, and for the future they hope to leave behind. The Vorthan ambassador's expression shifted slightly, showing the first hint of uncertainty he had displayed during the exchange. Words, he said dismissively, but with less conviction than before. Pretty speeches that will mean nothing when your ships burn in the void. Perhaps, Lisa agreed. But Admiral Jake Sullivan and the Earth Defense Fleet are already en route to Alliance space. Within 3 weeks, you will have the opportunity to test your theories against human reality rather than human rhetoric. The mention of actual military deployment sent another wave of surprised murmurs through the chamber. This was no longer just diplomatic posturing or symbolic gesture. Earth had apparently committed real military assets to the conflict, despite the obvious mismatch in capabilities. Krex studied Lisa for a long moment before speaking again. Very well, human. When your admiral's ships join the debris fields that mark our previous victories, perhaps the galaxy will finally understand that the age of resistance has ended. The Vorthan Empire offers one final opportunity for reason to prevail over foolish sentiment. He turned to address the full chamber, his voice carrying the authority of a conquering empire. Any species that provides material support to the humans, or their doomed alliance, will be considered hostile to Vorthan interests. Choose wisely whether brief defiance is worth the eternal consequences. With that warning, Ambassador Krex strode from the chamber, his heavy footsteps echoing in the silence he left behind. The delegates watched him go, then turned their attention back to Lisa Monroe, who remained at the central platform with the same calm composure she had shown throughout the confrontation. Zephyr finally found her voice. Ambassador Monroe, does Earth truly understand the implications of the commitment you have announced today? The Vorthan Empire does not make idle threats. Lisa looked around the chamber one final time. 3 weeks after Lisa Monroe's shocking declaration, the first human ships began arriving in Alliance space near the contested Rigel sector. The galactic intelligence networks buzzed with activity as military analysts from dozens of species attempted to assess the capabilities of Earth's mysterious defense fleet, Admiral. Jake Sullivan stood on the bridge of the UES Liberty, watching through the main view screen as his ships took their positions alongside Alliance vessels. The contrast was immediately apparent to any observer. The sleek, energy-efficient designs of Alliance ships gleamed with polished hulls and elegant curves that spoke of centuries of peaceful technological development. The human vessels looked crude by comparison, their angular hulls constructed from basic steel alloys and covered with sensor arrays that seemed primitive by galactic standards. The Liberty itself was a perfect example of human military philosophy. Where Alliance ships prioritized comfort and efficiency, the human flagship was built for one purpose: fighting and winning battles regardless of the cost. Her hull was thick and heavily armored, her weapon systems were mounted in redundant configurations, and her crew quarters were Spartan by galactic standards. Every design choice reflected the harsh lessons learned from humanity's violent past. Captain Amy Rodriguez commanded the destroyer UES Defiance, one of the smaller vessels in Sullivan's fleet. She had spent the journey from Earth studying intelligence reports about Vorthan military tactics, and what she read both impressed and disgusted her. The Vorthans were undeniably skilled warriors, but their methods reminded her uncomfortably of the worst periods in human history. Alliance Admiral Vextar, the Centauri commander who had survived the disaster at Kepler's Edge, welcomed the human fleet with polite but obvious skepticism. His tactical briefings made it clear that he viewed the human ships as little more than additional targets for Vorthan gunners to practice on. The humans had brought approximately 200 vessels of various sizes, which seemed insignificant compared to the thousands of ships the Vorthans could deploy when they chose to concentrate their forces. The first indication that human capabilities might exceed expectations came during routine tactical exercises. Alliance fleet doctrine emphasized precise formations and coordinated energy weapon strikes designed to disable enemy vessels with minimal damage to their crews. The goal was always to force surrender rather than destruction, preserving both ships and lives whenever possible. Human tactical doctrine was fundamentally different. During joint exercises, Alliance commanders watched in fascination and growing alarm as human ships demonstrated maneuvers that no galactic military academy would teach. Instead of maintaining careful formations, human vessels spread out in seemingly random patterns that made coordinated defense nearly impossible. Their weapon systems targeted engines, life support, and command centers with ruthless efficiency that prioritized mission success over enemy casualties. Most disturbing to Alliance observers was humanity's apparent indifference to their own losses during combat simulations. When faced with superior firepower, human commanders routinely ordered ramming attacks or suicide runs that would cripple enemy vessels at the cost of their own ships and crews. This willingness to trade lives for tactical advantage was completely alien to species that had grown accustomed to civilized warfare with minimal casualties. The first real test of human military doctrine came sooner than anyone expected. Vorthan patrol squadrons had been probing Alliance defenses throughout the sector, testing response times and gathering intelligence about fleet dispositions. These raids typically followed predictable patterns: fast strikes against isolated targets, followed by rapid withdrawal before Alliance reinforcements could arrive. Captain Rodriguez received her combat orders while the Defiance was escorting a supply convoy near the moon of Sigma 7. Long-range sensors detected 6 Vorthan attack ships approaching the Alliance monitoring station, apparently intent on destroying the facility and capturing its intelligence archives. Standard Alliance protocol would be to transmit a distress signal and wait for reinforcements while attempting to negotiate with the attackers. Rodriguez ignored standard protocol completely. She ordered the convoy to scatter, while the Defiance accelerated toward the enemy formation at maximum speed. Her tactical officer protested that engaging 6 enemy ships with a single destroyer was essentially suicide, but Rodriguez's response silenced all objections. "The Vorthans expect us to run or hide until help arrives," she announced over the ship's communication system. "They have never faced an enemy willing to fight them on equal terms. Today they learn what human determination looks like." The Battle of Sigma 7 lasted exactly 18 minutes, but its impact would resonate throughout the galaxy for years to come. The Defiance approached the Vorthan formation using an attack pattern that violated every principle of galactic naval warfare. Instead of maintaining safe engagement distances, Rodriguez ordered her ship directly into the enemy formation where superior numbers became a disadvantage rather than an asset. The human destroyer's weapon systems had been modified during the journey from Earth, incorporating targeting algorithms based on centuries of human conflict. Where Alliance weapons were designed to disable without destroying, Human armaments were built to eliminate threats as quickly and efficiently as possible. The Defiance's missile systems locked onto Vorthan engine signatures, while her energy weapons targeted command sections and life support systems. What shocked Vorthan commanders even more than human weapons technology was the crew's behavior under fire. When the Defiance suffered critical damage to her port engines, Rodriguez ordered emergency power redirected to weapons rather than life support. When Vorthan boarding parties attempted to capture the bridge, human Marines fought with a ferocity that left enemy survivors describing the encounter as more like facing wild animals than civilized soldiers. The climax of the battle came when the Defiance found herself surrounded by 3 remaining Vorthan ships, her shields down and hull breached in multiple locations. Any Alliance commander would have surrendered at that point, preserving his crew for prisoner exchange and his ship for potential recovery. Rodriguez chose a different option. She ordered ramming speed toward the largest Vorthan vessel while directing all remaining power to the ship's self-destruct systems. The collision destroyed both ships instantly, but the explosion also crippled the other 2 Vorthan vessels badly, enough for Alliance reinforcements to capture them when they finally arrived. News of the battle spread through galactic intelligence networks within hours. The idea that a single human ship had not only engaged superior enemy forces, but had actually achieved tactical victory through methods that bordered on insanity sent shockwaves through military commands across the galaxy. Fourth-hand fleet dispositions began shifting as commanders who had never known defeat suddenly found themselves facing an enemy that fought by completely different rules. Admiral Sullivan received detailed reports about the engagement while planning his own operations against Vorthan supply lines. The sacrifice of the Defiance and her crew troubled him, but he also recognized that Rodriguez had achieved something more valuable than a single tactical victory. She had demonstrated to both allies and enemies that human military doctrine was based on principles that the galaxy had forgotten during its long peace alliance. Commanders began requesting human tactical advisors for their own operations, hoping to understand how Earth's military leaders approached problems that had seemed unsolvable using conventional methods. The humans were willing to share their knowledge, but they also made it clear that their methods came with costs that not all species might be willing to pay. Meanwhile, Vorthan intelligence analysts struggled to comprehend reports from the Sigma-7 engagement. Their military doctrine was based on overwhelming superior force and the assumption that rational enemies would surrender when faced with certain defeat. The concept of an enemy that would choose destruction over submission was so alien to their thinking that many commanders dismissed the reports as propaganda or miscommunication. This fundamental misunderstanding of human psychology would prove to be the Vorthan Empire's greatest strategic error. They had conquered dozens of civilizations by demonstrating that resistance was futile and that surrender was the rational choice for preserving life and resources. But humanity had learned different lessons from their own history, lessons about the price of freedom and the value of principles that were worth dying to defend. As human ships continued arriving in Alliance space, galactic observers began to realize that Earth had not sent a token force to make a symbolic gesture of support. The humans were preparing for total war against an enemy they viewed as an existential threat to everything they valued. The galaxy was about to witness a type of warfare that had been absent from civilized space for so long that most species had forgotten it ever existed. The age of genteel conflict was ending, and humanity was teaching the galaxy to remember what war really meant. 6 months after humanity's entry into the Galactic War, the strategic situation had transformed beyond recognition. What had begun as the Alliance's inevitable defeat had evolved into a brutal stalemate that stretched across dozens of star systems. The Vorthan advance had not only stopped, but had begun to reverse in several key sectors. General Helen Carter stood in the command bunker on Proxima Beta, studying tactical displays that showed the current disposition of forces across the contested planet. The world had been under Vorthan occupation for 8 months before joint Human Alliance forces launched their counteroffensive. Now the planet had become a testing ground for military doctrines that represented fundamentally different approaches to warfare. The contrast between human and Alliance ground forces was even more pronounced than their differences in space combat. Alliance troops wore advanced powered armor that provided comprehensive protection while maintaining mobility and communication links. Their weapons were precision instruments designed to neutralize threats with minimal collateral damage. Their tactics emphasized surgical strikes and careful coordination to achieve objectives while preserving both friendly and enemy casualties. Human Marines operated under entirely different principles. Their equipment was heavier and more basic, but it was also more reliable and easier to repair under field conditions. Where Alliance soldiers carried energy weapons that required sophisticated power cells and maintenance protocols, humans relied on kinetic firearms that could function in almost any environment. Their armor was designed to stop enemy fire rather than provide comfort or enhanced mobility. The psychological differences between the two military cultures became apparent during the first joint operations on Proxima Beta. Alliance commanders planned careful advances that would minimize casualties while gradually pushing Vorthan forces back from strategic positions. Human officers proposed direct assaults on enemy strongholds that would achieve rapid results at the cost of heavy losses. Commander Rick Barnes led one of the most successful human operations on the planet, a covert mission that exemplified humanity's unconventional approach to warfare. Intelligence reports indicated that the Vorthons had established a major command center in the ruins of Proxima Beta's former capital city. Alliance planners had developed a complex strategy involving weeks of reconnaissance, followed by coordinated strikes from multiple directions. Barnes ignored the Alliance plan completely. He selected 20 volunteers from his regiment and approached the enemy facility using tactics that would have been considered primitive by galactic standards. Instead of advanced stealth technology, his team relied on careful observation of enemy patrol patterns and simple camouflage techniques. Instead of sophisticated electronic warfare, they used explosives and small arms to create chaos and confusion. The raid succeeded because the Vorthons had never encountered enemies who operated without regard for their own safety. Barnes's team infiltrated the command facility by exploiting the psychological blind spots of defenders who expected rational opponents to value self-preservation above mission objectives. When Vorthon security detected the human infiltrators, the defenders assumed they were facing a much larger force because no rational commander would send such a small team against a heavily fortified position. The destruction of the command center disrupted Vorthan communications across an entire continent, allowing Alliance forces to advance rapidly while enemy units struggled to coordinate their response. The success came at a terrible cost. 15 of Barnes's 20 volunteers died in the assault, and Barnes himself spent 3 weeks in a medical facility, recovering from injuries that would have killed most galactic species. Similar stories emerged from battlefields across the contested worlds as human tactical doctrine began to influence Alliance military operations. Human commanders demonstrated an unsettling ability to achieve victory through methods that other species found morally questionable. They targeted civilian infrastructure when it served military purposes, used captured Vorthan equipment, without regard for galactic conventions about proper treatment of enemy property, and employed psychological warfare techniques that deliberately caused terror among enemy populations. The transformation was equally dramatic in space combat. Admiral Sullivan had spent months integrating captured Vorthan vessels into his fleet, a practice that violated several galactic treaties about the treatment of enemy property. Human engineers modified these ships extensively, removing crew comfort systems and installing additional weapons and armor. The sight of Vorthan vessels operating under human command became a powerful symbol of the war's changing dynamics. The Battle of Kepler's Return demonstrated the full evolution of human naval doctrine. Vorthan forces had established a major fleet base in the system, where they had achieved their greatest victory against Alliance forces. The base served as a staging area for raids against Alliance supply lines and represented the furthest extent of Vorthan territorial expansion. Sullivan's attack on the base employed tactics that would have been unthinkable before humanity's involvement in the war. Instead of the careful, methodical approach favored by Alliance commanders, the human fleet launched a coordinated assault that prioritized speed and violence over preservation of life and property. Human ships targeted Vorthon civilian installations without hesitation, reasoning that anything that supported the enemy war effort was a legitimate military target. The assault succeeded, but its methods shocked even Alliance commanders who had grown accustomed to human tactical innovations. When Vorthan defenders attempted to negotiate surrender terms, Sullivan rejected all proposals and continued the attack until enemy resistance was completely eliminated. His justification was simple. The Vorthans had shown no mercy to conquered populations, so they deserved none in return. The psychological impact of the victory extended far beyond its immediate tactical value. For the first time in the war, Vorthan military commanders faced the reality that their empire was not invincible. The species that had conquered 17 star systems through superior firepower and ruthless determination had encountered enemies who were even more ruthless and far more determined. Vorthan intelligence analysts struggled to understand reports from the various battlefields where human forces had achieved unexpected victories. Their military doctrine was based on rational calculation of costs and benefits, with the assumption that enemies would surrender when continued resistance became futile. The concept of opponents who would fight to total destruction rather than accept defeat was so alien to their thinking that many commanders continued to believe that human behavior was simply elaborate psychological warfare designed to confuse them. This fundamental misunderstanding led to strategic errors that compounded as the war continued. Vorthan forces began fortifying positions that humans would simply bypass, concentrating firepower against targets that humans would abandon without hesitation, and planning operations based on assumptions about enemy behavior that proved completely wrong when applied to human commanders. Meanwhile, Alliance military leaders found themselves grappling with ethical questions that had not arisen during previous conflicts. Human success was undeniable, but their methods challenged basic assumptions about civilized warfare that had guided galactic military doctrine for centuries. Some Alliance commanders embraced human tactical innovations enthusiastically, while others worried about the long-term consequences of abandoning traditional restraints on military conduct. The debate intensified when human forces began recruiting volunteers from other species who were willing to adopt human military doctrine in exchange for more effective training and equipment. These integrated units achieved remarkable success against Vorthan forces, but they also demonstrated behavioral changes that concerned Alliance political leaders. Soldiers who had originally enlisted to defend their homes began talking about total victory and the complete destruction of enemy forces. General Carter observed these developments with mixed feelings as she planned the final assault on Proxima Beta's remaining Vorthan strongholds. The transformation of Alliance military culture was proceeding faster than anyone had anticipated, and the results were undeniably effective. Worlds that had been written off as permanently lost to Vorthan occupation were being liberated through human tactical innovations. But she also recognized that the galaxy was changing in ways that could not be easily reversed. The age of limited warfare and civilized conflict was ending, replaced by a new reality where survival required the willingness to employ any method that achieved victory. Whether this transformation represented progress or regression was a question that historians would debate for generations to come. What mattered now was that the Vorthan Empire was finally facing defeat, and humanity had given the galaxy the tools it needed to ensure that defeat was total and permanent. 18 months after humanity declared war on the Vorthan Empire, Admiral Jake Sullivan stood on the bridge of the UES Liberty as the combined human alliance fleet entered the Vorthan home system. The sight before him was both magnificent and terrible. Thousands of ships from dozens of species united under a single purpose that would have been unthinkable before human involvement in the Galactic War. The fleet composition told the story of humanity's transformation of galactic military doctrine. Alliance vessels still maintained their elegant designs, but they now carried weapon systems based on human tactical philosophy. Vorthan ships captured during previous battles operated alongside their former enemies, their hulls repainted but their aggressive capabilities intact. And throughout the formation, human vessels served as the backbone that held the entire force together through sheer determination and tactical innovation. The Vorthan home system represented the final test of everything humanity had taught the galaxy about warfare. The system contained not only the Empire's capital world, but also the largest concentration of military and industrial facilities in Vorthan space. Defending it were the remnants of an empire that had once seemed unstoppable, now reduced to making their last stand in the place where their civilization had begun. Admiral Sullivan received reports from his reconnaissance squadrons as the fleet approached the outer planets. Fourth and defensive preparations were extensive and sophisticated, incorporating lessons learned from 18 months of defeats at human hands. They had abandoned the conventional formations that human tactics had proven vulnerable, instead creating overlapping fields of fire that would force attackers to accept massive casualties regardless of their tactical approach. The scale of the coming battle was unprecedented in galactic history. Over 15,000 ships prepared to engage in combat that would determine not only the fate of the Vorthan Empire, but the future direction of galactic civilization. The stakes were absolute. Victory would end the war and establish humanity as the dominant military power in the galaxy, while defeat would likely result in the complete destruction of both human and Alliance forces. Colonel Dan Murphy commanded the ground forces that would assault the Vorthan capital once orbital defenses were eliminated. His troops represented the ultimate evolution of human military doctrine, incorporating volunteers from dozens of species who had embraced humanity's approach to total warfare. These soldiers had abandoned the restraints that had limited galactic military effectiveness for centuries, accepting that victory required the willingness to pay any price and employ any method. The battle began when Vorthan defensive platforms opened fire on the approaching fleet at maximum range. Unlike previous engagements, the defenders made no attempt to negotiate or offer terms for surrender. They had learned that humans viewed such gestures as signs of weakness rather than opportunities for reasonable compromise. The war had become a contest of wills where only complete victory or total destruction were acceptable outcomes. Human tactical innovations that had shocked the galaxy during the early months of the war were now standard operating procedure for the entire fleet. Ships deliberately targeted civilian infrastructure to force military surrender. Commanders routinely ordered suicide attacks when tactical situations required them. And psychological warfare techniques created terror among enemy populations who had never experienced such brutal methods. The space battle raged for 3 days as the combined fleet systematically destroyed Vorthan orbital defenses through methods that prioritized effectiveness over preservation of life and property. When enemy commanders attempted to surrender individual installations, human officers rejected all proposals and continued attacking until resistance was completely eliminated. The goal was not merely to win the battle, but to ensure that Vorthan military capability could never threaten galactic peace again. Admiral Sullivan coordinated the final assault on the capital world's surface defenses from his command ship, watching as human and Alliance forces implemented tactics that would have been considered war crimes before humanity's involvement in the conflict. Orbital bombardments targeted not only military installations, but also the industrial facilities and transportation networks that supported Vorthan war production. The systematic destruction continued until enemy resistance collapsed completely. Colonel Murphy's ground assault began as soon as orbital bombardments created safe landing zones around the Vorthan capital city. His forces employed urban warfare techniques that overwhelmed defenders who had expected conventional siege operations. Human Marines led integrated units that moved through the city like a destructive flood, eliminating resistance through methods that prioritized speed and violence over careful preservation of civilian infrastructure. The final moment of the war came when Vorthan leadership realized that continued resistance would result in the complete annihilation of their civilization. Unlike previous conflicts where defeated enemies could expect reasonable treatment and eventual rehabilitation, the humans had made it clear that the Vorthan Empire would be dismantled completely. Surrender was not a tactical retreat, but an acknowledgement of absolute defeat. The formal surrender ceremony took place in the ruins of the Vorthan Imperial Palace, with Lisa Monroe representing Earth alongside Alliance leadership. The terms imposed on the defeated empire reflected humanity's approach to ensuring lasting peace. Vorthan military forces would be disbanded permanently, their industrial capacity would be redirected toward reparations for damaged worlds, and their political system would be restructured under galactic supervision. More significantly, the surrender established precedents that would reshape galactic civilization for generations to come. The concept of limited warfare with negotiated settlements was officially abandoned in favor of total victory, achieved through whatever methods proved necessary. Species that had grown comfortable during centuries of peace now understood that future conflicts would be fought with the ruthless efficiency that humanity had brought to galactic military doctrine. Lisa Monroe addressed the transformed Galactic Council 6 months after the war's end, speaking from a position of unprecedented influence that reflected Earth's new status as the galaxy's dominant military power. Her speech outlined humanity's vision for galactic peace, one maintained not through diplomatic compromise and mutual goodwill, but through the clear understanding that aggressive species would face complete destruction if they threatened civilized worlds. The war crimes tribunals that followed revealed the full extent of humanity's impact on galactic military philosophy. While human forces had technically operated within existing galactic law, they had demonstrated methods that other species had considered morally unthinkable. The galaxy realized that humanity's concept of proportional response differed dramatically from the restraints that had governed civilized warfare for centuries. Admiral Sullivan was appointed as the first supreme military commander of the new Galactic Defense Force tasked with ensuring that no future aggressor would threaten galactic peace. His appointment reflected the reality that only human military doctrine had proven effective against enemies who refused to accept civilized limitations on their conduct. The galaxy had learned that sometimes peace could only be preserved through the threat of total war. The final transformation was visible in the restructured Galactic Council chambers, where Earth's delegation now occupied a position of prominence that reflected their species' contribution to galactic security. Human military advisors worked with every major civilization to implement tactical innovations that would prevent future conflicts from reaching the scale of the Vorthan War. As Lisa Monroe reviewed reports from across the galaxy in her expanded office, one message caught her attention. Intelligence suggested that unknown signals were being detected from beyond the galactic rim, possibly indicating the approach of another threat to civilized space. She smiled slightly as she began drafting her response, knowing that humanity had given the galaxy the tools and mindset it needed to face any challenge. The age of genteel conflict and civilized warfare had ended permanently. In its place stood a new galactic order based on the understanding that peace was a precious thing worth defending through any means necessary. Humanity had not only won a war, but had fundamentally changed how the galaxy approached the concept of survival itself. The stars were safer now, protected by species that had learned the most important lesson in human history. Sometimes the only way to preserve civilization is through the complete destruction of those who would threaten it.